Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Mark de Swan-Arons. I'm actually calling in from Copenhagen in Denmark today, normally based in New York. And it is my extreme honor to welcome someone who is also in New York. And I will introduce her properly in a minute. But welcome, Halla Tómasdóttir. And please tell me, where are you and how are you?
Oh, thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. I am on Long Island, New York, and I am doing really well because, as you may see, the sun is out and I
Yes.
feel like spring is in the air.
Wow, that's a lot of places in the world don't feel like spring yet. I know. That's good to hear. And it makes a psychological difference, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Well, Hadle, it's very special to have you today in this Humanized Growth Seminar. Um, I want to give everyone listening and looking in a proper introduction on your background because it is an impressive one. Starting on the corporate side, where so many of today's viewers are from, with both Pepsi and Mars, I believe in HR functions. So you've got that human orientation right there from the start. Moving on to, I would say, a course, the actual Women Entrepreneur Initiative from the Reykjavik, Iceland, I should have said, university, and then actually fighting the cause of gender gap until you became the first, if I believe, right, the first CEO of the Icelandic Chamber of Commerce. And apparently, things weren't changing fast enough because you decided in 2016 to become an independent candidate for the presidential elections and garnered no less than 32% of the vote. So almost made it. And I don't think I've ever spoken to a presidential candidate before, so that makes it extra special. Before you went even more global and ultimately landed in New York as the global CEO of an organization that I think everyone has heard about, the B Team, but probably a lot of people think they know what it does, but don't know enough about it. So, Hadley, a very, very warm welcome and thank you. And please, perhaps tell me a little bit first about the B Team and what it is you do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And just to be sure, I was the first female CEO of the Iceland Chamber of Commerce. It had existed for 90 years when I became, so not the first CEO. And I only got 28% in the presidential
Oh.
election. So don't feel flattered at all. I barely, and I had 1% following 45 days before before we actually came to election day. So I definitely, anybody can do what I did there, and maybe we'll get to that a little bit. But the B Team is here to catalyze a just and inclusive transition to a future that is people and nature positive. So we often call this destination that we're trying to help craft in the world a future where we can love where we live. And I don't think I need to describe to anyone today in this troubled world of ours, as much as the sun shines, we have trouble everywhere we look, interdependent challenges that we are facing. So in order to tackle that, we need to shift leadership norms. We need to shift definitions of success and make sure that that is inclusive of the well-being of people and planet. And we need to reset the rules and policies in our economy so we actually measure and incentivize the things that truly matter to us as human beings and truly matter to the future of the next generation. So that's what we're doing, and that is a very complex and hard work to explain at times, but we convene bold conversations, often between unlikely allies. We really try to lead by brave actions in our own organizations. Our members are people like Mark Benioff, who leads Salesforce, or Jochen Seitz, who was the youngest CEO of Puma, a listed company ever when he led Puma, but is now the CEO of Harley Davidson. People like Richard Branson, Paul Polman, who led Unilever, but also civil society leaders like Christiana Figueres, who led the Paris Agreement, Sharon Burrow, who's the global leader of the labor movement, and Mary Robinson, who was the first female president of Ireland, to name just a few out of the 30. So basically a lot of what happens when we were founded on the back sort of the financial crisis in 2008, a lot of conversations started between many. And by 2030, we were founded around the notion that business as usual was no longer an option. And in 2013, that was considered quite novel to say. But I would say we've gotten to a place today where most people realize that business as usual is no longer an option. The planetary boundaries are threatened. The social fabric is weak, if not broken. Trust is at the lowest we've ever seen it. Our democracies are suffering. We got COVID on the back of all of that. It is accelerating already unsustainable levels of inequality. So we see all of these issues as interdependent, and business, governments, and civil society as interdependent as well, and really try to find ways to shift these norms through our own actions, through storytelling, through convening conversations, through building coalitions, and through pushing governments to write the rules in our economy. So it's complex work, really fun, really hard, and I feel very privileged to get to do that.
Well, and if you don't mind, I really want to drill down on some of those themes later in the conversation. It's clearly a very important organization. I'd like to enter it though through your own personal journey, because I wasn't joking when I said I hadn't spoken before to someone that has been a presidential candidate. It's a track record with clear direction, and it gives a little bit of a sense of purpose. And I always would like to understand the person better by asking you about your purpose and how it's guided you in your choices.
Yeah, that's such a good and important question, Mark. Today, I would describe my purpose roughly as I'm here to unlock leadership in service of a better world. And today, that feels very clear and crisp to me. But I would be lying if I had that clarity my entire career. Yet, in retrospect, when I look back, I feel like everything I've done has in one way or another been about that, but I'm not sure I was always aware of that. And so it took a lot of diverse work and life experiences to really land where I am, where I feel like everything I care about and everything I'm somewhat good at comes together in the role that I am in today. But I think the first I left corporate America just as I was turning 30. And I left, I worked for very great companies. I had a lot of fun at work, but somehow it didn't feel very meaningful to me as I was kind of going to turn 30, what kind of a life it was to push more sugared water. At the time, this is in the 90s, it just didn't feel like even as much fun I was having, so much growth I was having, purpose wasn't talked about a lot. I will say I give Mars a lot of credit back then because they had these strong principles that really guided their way, and I think have delivered them. Yeah, I mean, amazing. 5 Principles of Mars was almost like you came to a special world when you worked for them. But it was also a privately owned company, and Pepsi-Cola that I went to work for later was a listed company, and really they had great vision and a value statement, but sometimes the capital markets honestly ruled the culture and the decisions that were made a little more than what was right long-term for people or planet. And so we've come a long way since the 90s, but I left to go back to Iceland to find sort of more meaning in my life. I fell in love, I became a mom, I joined the founding team of a new university, started working a lot on empowering women as entrepreneurs and investors. But I also helped a lot of students of all ages, adults and young, and a lot of organizations help come up with their own compass. And I started calling it a manifesto or a compass that I thought needed to lead everybody, organizations and individuals alike. So I wrote my first one then, probably around the age of 30. I have updated it many times since, Mark. I think I wrote version 16 in 2016 when I ran for president. It hasn't changed materially. The same thing is always coming up when I go back and look at some of the versions that I kept, but it's always gotten clearer and clearer. And I think nothing made it clearer than when I ran for office, because there is nothing that will require you to really have a conversation with your heart and your insights as offering yourself up for service like that. And everybody has an opinion about you. Everybody thinks has a view as to what you should say, what you shouldn't say, how you should behave, and when you're a woman, also how you dress, what your hair looks like, and God knows what else. So it really, and I had 1%, as I said before, and I just want to uplift that. 45 days before the election, I was an unlikely entrepreneurial candidate. It was hard, and when I had 1% in the polls, everybody asked me if I was going to quit. And I just had to really go to that moral compass, if you will, that insight and find the answer there. And my answer was, I didn't run to role model quitting. I ran because I cared deeply about the future of my country, the future that my kids inherit. And that kept me going and got me to that nearly 30% in 45 days. And so I just really, really believe that everything about leadership starts with knowing your inner compass, your moral compass, whatever you want to call it. You have to know your why, the purpose, and you have to be very clear on the principles that are going to help you make decisions, even more so now when we live in this constant era of uncertainty. If you don't have that clarity, I think your own well-being and resilience suffers. And I don't think as an organization or a brand that you can survive without that absolute clarity. So I'm a huge believer in having a manifesto or a compass and using that as the navigation and resilience tool in life.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention at this point, at the end of March, the Institute for Real Growth is organizing a retreat in Panama. And the theme is reconnecting with human nature. And it's all about the leaders there, first at an individual personal level, reconnecting and redefining their compass, because following the Great Resignation, we find that so many leaders are worn out and questioning whether they're in the right place. But we're also doing it in the Panamanian jungle because we want to connect that purpose very clearly to what it is the world needs from us as leaders. Reconnecting to human nature is the website. Very clear, and I love how you said how you kept tuning it, but actually found that it was there all the time. You just hadn't specified it that clearly. And now you get the opportunity to lead an organization that some have described your role as the herder of lions. You mentioned a few names there, all of which I would be nervous. Of course, I would really love to be in a room with them, if I'm really honest. But you don't tell these people likely what to do, and trying to bring more than one in a room is probably quite an experience. So, what do you do at the B team? How does it work?
Yeah, thanks for referencing that unofficial title that I believe I gave myself. I call myself a lion herder, and Jochen Seitz, the co-founder of the B team, regularly reminds me that we also have lionesses and that I'm one of them. But all joking aside, I have always, my whole life, suffered some of that imposter syndrome or imposter thoughts that I think so many of us know. I've never thought that I was worthy of many of the opportunities that I've taken on, or had everything that it would take to take on the challenges I've taken on. And that was also true for this role. But I've also learned on this journey that almost everybody has those feelings. And when I did my first speech in front of Richard Branson and shared the imposter syndrome, because the crowd was really dropping from their head to their heart, and I shared that I had struggled with that, he openly shared in front of everybody that that's been a part of his entire life, and he's the most successful entrepreneur in the world. So I like to just start there, that we are all human beings and suffer from a lot of the same challenges on the inside of ourselves and in the context we live in. But I am herding lions. These are really big personalities who've been hugely successful. They have big dreams and are very passionate and passionate about a lot of things. So one of the biggest challenges is, how do you get 30 people of that magnitude who actually, if they use their voice and vision collectively, can move mountains and change landscape? They actually can. So I saw the potential in that and took the role because of that. But how do you get them to be on one page? And so the first thing I did with them, Mark, was actually created around Mark Benioff's Ohana table at the top floor of the Salesforce building in 2018 when I joined as their CEO. We co-created the B Team Leadership Compass. And that compass has become the source of everything we've done, our strategy, what we do on the staff team, how we wrote our culture charter. It states our purpose to be in service of humanity's future. It states our principles to be sustainability, equality, and accountability. And it talks about the need for both courage and humility in pursuing that mission. So we have great clarity on what compass we are embracing, what that means and what we expect from our leaders. So I think the first thing you do when you have a group of people who are not aligned, and I would say this is pretty true for a lot of people in the world today, we have never been more divided, is you figure out our commonalities and what unites us, and you craft that moral compass or that inner compass that's going to guide your journey. That's where everything starts for me. And I really spend time figuring out what they care about. And that sits in the heart, not in the head. So I really do try to do a lot of things when I work with them to help them drop from their head to their hearts, to really talk about what they care about. And what I have discovered, not just with the B team leaders, but with humans in general, is that there's so much more common ground when we talk about what we care about than when we talk about and argue about the ways to get to a world that we care about, where we can breathe clean air, where we can enjoy nature, where we can eat food that doesn't kill us, where we can be healthy, earn a living, support our children, and see a bright future for them. I have yet to meet a human being that doesn't want that.
All of those.
But we argue about the way, how to get there. So yeah, we do a lot of different things. I mean, I just want to say I gave them 2 words. I try to keep it simple. I gave them 2 words when I joined: courage and accountability. And I told them that we needed to become, first I said 5 times bolder on our quest, because the world really needs brave leadership now like never before. Now I'm saying 10 times bolder. I created accountability mechanisms to create a little bit of a peer pressure so that they actually get each other to unlock more courage by being together. I call it a community of courage and accountability. And in a way, in the design of the B team, we have that built in because we have leaders from business and we have leaders from civil society. And some of the best moments we have is when we call on each other to do more, to rise to this moment, to be braver, to make some bold decisions in our own organizations, but also collectively go out and raise our voice boldly, both behind the scenes. We do a lot of that. We call heads of states and ask them to do more before global moments. We write letters and tell governmental leaders where business thinks we can go further. You can be braver as a governmental leader. We sit down with indigenous people, the next generation, and have conversations across the typical divides. Labor leaders and business leaders sit together and talk about how do we make this energy transition just and inclusive. And so a lot of our work is about bridging gaps and understanding that in order to get from where we are to a future where we love where we live, we're going to have to build a lot more bridges between the interdependent stakeholders of business, governments, and civil society. And we're going to have to understand that most of the issues we're dealing with are intersectional. Climate is going to accelerate inequality. The issue with low trust and inequality is eroding our democratic fabric. Climate is even becoming a democratic issue in our democracies. It should just be an issue for humanity. It doesn't have anything to do with politics. It's just work that needs to be done. But it becomes political, as did COVID and masks. And so we're troubled. And I guess the B team leaders humbly are trying to be a small catalyst, but a mighty one, in helping us accelerate the transition we have to go through.
So I want to get to the real mechanism of the value you add to the leaders that are, I mean, these 40 are pioneers. They are the ones that paved the way in many ways. Polman just recently wrote his book where he set out some principles, and I'm actually speaking to him in a few weeks about his book and about his framework, if you like. But listening to this conversation, our leaders, 1 level down, 2 level down, that are converted. I mean, we're preaching to the converted in that sense. And your change work there is highly recognized. But what I'm trying to get to a little bit more is the support that you can offer the listeners who know what they want to do, but don't necessarily know how to do it. What is it that you offer? I know, for example, you have a leadership playbook. Can you talk a little bit about the practical side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for raising that. And I just want to say, for people who are working, no matter where you work, you can embrace purpose and principle. So let's go back and start with, do you know your own inner compass? Whether you want to call it a moral compass or manifesto, it doesn't matter what you name it, but are you clear on that? Because I think you need that to be a change catalyst in this world. So you start there. And I think then we put out a new leadership playbook last fall, where we tell stories of transformation from many of our companies. go into deep dive conversations in a podcast with some of our leaders. A new season will come in the spring again, but have some deep dives into some interesting stories. Link to resources that can help you on this transformation journey. And last but not least, list the 9 questions we think every board, leadership team, branding team ought to be asking themselves. And it's 9 questions. And so I think the second thing I would say, what is imperative right now, is that we stop being knowers and start being learners. And we need to shift from thinking we have the answers to starting to find the answers and do it increasingly in a much more inclusive way. So it's interesting. We often ask, why are we not accelerating this transition at the speed that science would ask us to do, or even the business opportunity? Because the numbers are there. It's more jobs, it's better jobs, it's economic growth, it's good for us. Everything about our agenda is good for all of humanity if we do it well. Well, one reason we're not is that human beings, well, first I would like to say, I think there is a crisis of conformity in leadership, and I think it sits in the boardroom. This is partly why we put out the new leadership playbook. So I think people who are 1, 2, 3, or 5, or 10 levels down in an organization, should any organization have that many levels, are critical to disrupting that crisis of conformity, because I don't see many boardrooms being bold. I don't. And while investors are demanding a lot, the organizations that I have seen move, they move because the talent moves them. It is primarily an employee game right now. So I don't care where you sit, you're a leader. I don't think leadership is something that is given to those in power alone. I think there's a leader inside of all of us. And it is time to use our voice as employees, use our votes as citizens, and use our wallets in terms of what we actually buy and do. And that's a tool and power that everybody has in their hands. Amazon created the climate pledge after 9,000 employees within the company demanded it. Google took on gender issues when employees said enough is enough. And I could go on. There are lots of examples of this. So I would say that, have your moral compass, use your voice, votes, and wallet, but make sure you understand that leadership is something that is inside of all of us. And all of us have the opportunity to ask ourselves good questions right now. And some of the questions I recommend we ask ourselves right now is, who are we choosing to be at a time that is like no other in our lifetimes? Maybe in history. We've never been at a moment that is quite this delicate and complex, I would say, and with so many crises overlapping each other. So who are you choosing to be? How are you choosing to lead? Are you choosing to lead as someone who has all the answers? Or are you choosing to lead to be a person that builds bridges, listens, learns about what is causing the resistance? Because there is resistance to this agenda. So even if we're all converted, the B team leaders are converted, and most of those listening are, what are we doing about removing the resistance? Are we just yelling louder, net zero by 2050? That's what the B team was doing when I joined them, and I don't blame anybody, but I don't think net zero by 2050 is a motivating statement. So I talk about a future where we love where we live. So I think people who are doing marketing, branding, thinking about impact, who I assume are in this audience, have such a big role to play, because marketers naturally listen. They naturally try to be empathetic to what not just the customer wants, but the employees, because marketing inside and outside the company has to go together. Yeah. And marketers naturally can bring this to the sitting CEOs and board directors in a way that I actually think is necessary, because let's be honest, and this includes the most progressive leaders in the world. CEOs, 90% of them are white men. Similarly for most boardrooms, they don't even see the issues that people are out on the streets demonstrating.
You and I, in our preparation conversation, we talked a little bit about this, and I'd like to pick that theme up. I imagine this force field, and the CEO is the coin that can fall on both sides. So it's standing on its side, and it can flip both ways. Now, to the right, we have my right, viewers left. We have first the boardroom, the non-executives, which is probably even less diverse than the CEO pool currently. And then beyond that, outside are the institutional investors. My sense is there's been quite a lot of change on the institutional investment side because they're taking the long perspective. If, obviously, when we take the BlackRock example, it's the loudest voice. Let's say, actually, we want you to drive value for more stakeholders. But then there's this group in between the CEO and them, which is the non-executive boardroom. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that in a minute. You've got the CEO, then you typically have a very large senior leadership group. That's where all our participants, the IRG leaders, are all in that group, reporting to the CEO or one level down. And then you have the mass audience of the internal audience. Now, you come from HR, typically represented by HR. And the role that marketing has played in the past is perhaps inspiring that group about the purpose and so, but not so much talking to the CEOs about what it is that our colleagues want. And there are these big changing, we've got the resignation. I mean, if there's ever a moment to think about, are we living up to their expectations? It's probably now. But have you seen examples where companies are navigating these force fields, learning from them and moving ahead?
Yeah, and I've unfortunately seen many where that doesn't work well. So you are right, investors are moving very forcefully now and demanding a lot more from companies along the ESG lines or and disclosures. Some are engaging with the companies to help them transform. Some are just, using negative or positive screening. There's different ways. But the fact of the matter is that we have at least 4 CEOs on the B team, or maybe more if we count the ones who successfully fought investors who are not there, because we still have a lot of investors who are not there and are still sort of stuck in the broken shareholder primacy era that measures only financial profit for the short term and only for the shareholder. So that's sort of the era that we're coming out of. And this transition into this era that I would call stakeholder economy, inclusive economy, stakeholder capitalism, there are all kinds of names for it, but where we actually understand that in order to even deliver profit for shareholders, we are going to need to be able to attract and retain talent. We're going to need to have community cohesion, because broken communities that are not good fertile ground for business. And we're going to need to sort of align the interest of all those stakeholders. That, though, too often we've seen brave CEOs actually fall victim to this broken system. So this transition where we're going from shareholder primacy into stakeholder capitalism, but the rules of the game are still set for shareholder primacy, is a very difficult transition to navigate. And so where I've seen success and where I've seen CEOs and successfully managed to not be brought down by short-term and narrow-minded investors is where the CEO gets active in changing its board, in resetting its board and creating a bold board that will support them in the long-term journey that this is, and understand that this is not about sacrificing profits, but it may be about making sure you can sustain those profits longer term. And where they have done the work with their senior teams and beyond, the inner work, because if you want to change the world, if you want to change your own organization, not to mention the world, changing your inner world is the beginning place. And so I found it very interesting, and Paul may tell you more about this, but with Unilever, when he put out, and he came on in 2009, right on the back of the financial crisis, and the first thing he said to investors was, I am not going to report to you quarterly. I think that's an outdated system. That was so brave in 2009, and I became a huge fan of Paul's brave leadership at that time. And then he met his investors, but he still got into trouble when Kraft tried to do a takeover and he had to fight hard. And it was not easy, I can tell you that. But he has told me, and I think he's spoken about this openly, that a huge part of getting not just the permafrost in the boardroom to melt towards the sustainable living plan, but also the sort of permafrost inside of the company, because a lot of people are still incentivized to deliver short-term profit alone for this, so we haven't aligned the incentives, and we haven't done the work on ourselves to be the kind of leaders that are needed for the complexity of dealing with that kind of a transformation. Business schools do not teach us the skills that we need today. I'm sorry to say, they teach us it's outdated as the business model, as the capital model, as the political model.
Dashboard that gets told.
Yeah.
So you talked about accountability, and I think you said that was one of the two terms you challenged your
Credit and
leadership with.
accountability, yeah.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about that, because one could argue that not a lot can change until there is transparency and accountability around progress in the other stakeholder value creation areas.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about this, but I've heard that the big accountants who would be auditing that one day, I assume, are actually working together to create some system. You have some publications. The United Nations Global Compact, another partner of the Institute for Real Growth, has produced. How do you see that progressing? And do you see some kind of coming together in what's important?
Yeah, it's interesting when you're talking about transforming and transitioning entire systems. We've talked about the talent and how important of a lever that is, and we've talked about investors and how important of a lever that is, but they also work both ways. But we haven't talked about the fact that the best news out of last year, and I think was accelerated because we've been going through COVID times, is that accountants unexpectedly have now become the change catalyst that we really need. And so where governments may not be moving as fast as I would like them to write the policies and incentives in the economy to match what needs to be done, accountants have now established International Sustainability Standards Board, so the IFRS that took 100 years to come up with common financial standards, is now going to boldly in a few years come up, and maybe as early as 2023, at least come up with a global baseline standard for the E of the ESG. And we are so fortunate that one of our B team leaders, Emmanuel Faber, the former CEO of Danone, which is one of the bravest global companies, and he was with it for 30 years and was on a transformation journey when he essentially had 1, maybe 2% of his investors questioned the plan. And that was enough to overturn his board and end his successful term there, to the devastation of all of his employees. But thankfully, in some ways, because now he's in service of this great ambition that we can actually get a global baseline standard on how to measure E, S, and the G. And the whole B team will throw its weight behind him to help make this happen fast. We know that the E is, fairly well developed by now, but we're not going to make progress on climate as we see in America and many other countries if we don't do it through a human lens. So we will really be pushing for the S in the ESG and the G, because without sort of good corporate governance and global governance, we can't tackle any of these challenges that are global in nature. And so before this happened, what we were looking at, Mark, is a jungle of metrics and measures and companies. I mean, this is an industry, and I celebrate the fact that it's an industry, but that is exhausting to CEOs and anyone in leadership.
It's got to come together
to navigate the jungle.
Yeah.
So we need a global baseline standard for transparent disclosures on the actual impacts that companies make. Now, I will tell you this, I think the ESG movement, and even this, is too investor focused. So I think there's more work to be done to really help companies figure out what they track. And I don't think the standard will be ambitious enough, Mark. I will also be honest to you about that. So I see two roles for the B team around this effort. One is to try to help it happen fast and be holistic. So be the full E, S, and G as fast as possible. And 2, to help raise the ambition of what we will include.
I mean, it's very inspiring to hear. But you raised a topic which I hadn't thought about before, which is that indeed, even organizations that are on the forefront of creating multi-shareholder value, perhaps on the inside, are using a dashboard for bonuses, incentives, that is still very much stuck in the Friedman era. And so have you seen developments and organizations really leading the way there and revolutionizing what the annual conversation looks like?
Yes, fortunately, there's great acceleration there. Just to name a couple, Salesforce just announced yesterday or a couple of days ago that now all of their executives are going to be measured and incentivized along the ESG metric.
Really?
So they're going full force with it. And then years ago, Allianz, which is one of our B team companies as well, it's the largest asset manager in Europe, not just an insurance company, but basically they have an ESG board and have had it for a number of years. And one of the most interesting things I think they do is once a year they bring in the children of the board directors to ask them really challenging questions. So they've built sort of an intergenerational dialogue into their board meetings around ESG metrics to help them constantly raise their game. And then they became one of the companies, along with another B team leader, Pension Denmark, that decided to put together a global collective of pension funds and asset owners that would align their portfolios with a net zero future. And so they've been at the forefront of kind of not just getting it right in their own companies, but actually getting other asset owners and bringing sort of a movement and a coalition along in the entire asset owner industry. And one reason we have like BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and other companies out there really embracing this more is because the asset owners, who all of the asset managers need, are asking the tough questions, are demanding the tough disclosures, and are not happy with the pace of progress, nor can we be. And Mark, I'm a straight talker, as you may have noticed. I don't think any of these efforts are good enough yet. And so we are not moving at the speed and scale that we need to be, and we're facing existential threats. And so I think it's not, in my opinion, good leadership anymore to just do right in your company. But the bare minimum to be called, I think basically my message to anyone here is, if you're not leading on embedding personal and planetary sustainability into the core of your purpose, your strategy, your brand, everything you do right now, if you're not leading on that, you will be left behind. But leading on that is still not enough, because you ought to be bringing, if you're in the food, you ought to be bringing the food sector along. If you're in money management, you ought to be bringing others along. If you're in consumer products, you ought to be figuring out the plastics issue together with others. And there is a lot more going on this front, these coalitions working together. And if you are saying that you want a carbon neutral future and you want a nature positive future, are you participating in organizations that are lobbying against regulations and policies in Washington, D.C. or at the European Union level at the same time? That's not credible, and that's going to hit you in the face. I think increasingly organizations will be held to account to do as they say, organizations and leaders. And we're going to see a lot of leaders lose their jobs if they put out brand messaging that doesn't match the actual reality of what they then, how they pay their people, how they incentivize them, what they actually do in their own lives, and so on and so forth. The era of accountability is here.
It's very clear. And what strikes me, that leaders could be forgiven for thinking, look, as long as the metrics aren't clear yet, as they're being sorted out, and as the alignment between the different metrics, I'm not going to weigh heavily one way or another, because it might be the wrong way. My experience is that most leaders' heart is in the right place, and they want to do this, but they talk about the challenge of not being held accountable to other standards, to other metrics. And so we're in a phase where big leaders are losing their jobs because they're doing what they feel is right. And what I hear you say is, don't wait for the metrics to be aligned. You need to be doing what you know is right. And for the whole ecosystem. Am I right?
Yeah. And I think thank you for bringing this up. I can take a very recent example. We had a nonprofit this week sort of call out two of the most progressive companies when it comes to addressing climate in the world, IKEA and Unilever. Both of them are B team companies and that we worked with. And let me just, and I actually love that. And IKEA immediately put out a statement and said, thank you for holding us to account. We're clearly not doing enough, and it's clearly not good enough. And which was very good and humble. And I think humility is a foundational leadership skill right now. Any arrogance in meeting that criticism is going to hit you hard on the head. But let's talk a little bit about what it means to be a brave leader. Right now, we don't have a map for how we get from the current reality to a future where we are people and nature positive. There is no map. So the companies that come together on the B team are often creating that map, and they are creating in the wake of their brave leadership more leadership from others. And that's a very specific goal of the B team, is to try to catalyze a much broader movement. But if we are so quick to criticize those who are going first and think that make perfection the enemy of progress, we risk demotivating those who are trying to navigate where we don't have the answers. Not just those who are moving fastest. They have decided to be brave and take the heat that comes with that. It's okay. But maybe those others who were wanting to go faster will not do it because they think it's actually easier just to sit on the sidelines. I don't want to put my neck out to do the right things because it might cost me my job. Yeah. So I worry a little bit about, I call it the cancer of otherness in society, where we're constantly pointing out the window instead of taking the mirror and thinking, what more could I do? What more could we do? And I think that otherness is risky. For example, in this case, what we're talking about is scope 3 emissions. I don't want to get too technical here, but it's all about your supply chain. And most of the emissions that companies need to reduce don't sit in their own operations or even in who they buy from. It sits in their, it's a lot of the supply chain issue. Nobody has a roadmap for that. We're trying to create them. And IKEA and Unilever happen to be at the forefront of that. So anyway, it's complex, Mark, and I don't want to leave anyone thinking that we don't want to be held to account. We do, and it's critical.
Let's bring it to that individual leader, because that's who's listening. That's literally our program. If you look at the IRG 100 program or the IRG 1000 program, they're very accomplished, very senior, very ambitious leaders that are in this force field. They want to do the right thing. We are not trying to convert anyone here. I know, and I see in the questions. By the way, if you have questions or suggestions, please do write in the chat. So they're in that force field. And I heard you say somewhere else, you know that we have this Da Vinci growth leader profile, and there are lots of experiences. They are marketing technical, but there are also 5 attitudes. And as you were talking, I was checking them off. You talked about agile learning, continuous learning. You talked about courage, and you call it humbleness. We call it servant leadership. But tell me about, you've got these lions. I don't particularly think of any Richard Branson, Paul Pullman. I don't immediately think of them as humble people. So how do you equate the two?
It's so important to ask this question. Thank you. And and actually the words we use in our leadership compass are bold and brave, partly because of that's how you would describe most of our leaders. But bold is really about courage, and bold is it's about 10 times bolder courage. It's not enough just to, it's really about courage at a 10 times bolder level. Brave is about being in service of something that is bigger than you. And the quality you need to embrace to do that is humility. And why do you need humility? Because frankly, Mark, none of us have the answers right now to these complex and interdependent challenges. But together we can and will find them, but only together, because nobody is waiting for leaders who say, I have the answer. And look where that's left us on the political scene or in lots of companies. People are looking for leaders that will have the wisdom and the humility to understand that we probably need to be bringing these diverse perspectives into the boardrooms, into the design rooms, because right now, sameness is giving us more of the same outcomes. So we often talk about on the B team, changing who to change how. Bring in, you want to sell products to the elderly, have an elderly person around the table when you're trying to figure it out, or the disabled, or how are you going to deal with the gender and the Me Too movement and the racial reckoning that is here without having gender balanced and racially and ethnically diverse decision-making rooms, from the top to the brand to, it's just impossible to lead this transformation without changing who. So I think, but it's also impossible to do it without embracing both courage, because we all need to get out of our comfort zone and this crisis of conformity. But we cannot do it without humility, because that's going to be thought of as arrogance, and arrogance is the enemy of leadership. It doesn't help build bridges. It doesn't bring people along. It doesn't bring out the best ideas or the authentic leadership in everyone. And the humility is a lot about knowing it's not just about us. Business leaders love to say, and I will tell you that 81% of people see businesses and brands as an essential part of the solution to get from where we are to where we need to be. And business leaders love to say, including sometimes my own leaders, and they always get an earful when I hear them say it, that business is the answers because governments are broken. I hate that sentence. Let me tell you why. Businesses need to lead with bravery and humility, no doubt. We need a lot more from them. We need to use the entrepreneurial skills from businesses and brands to forge ahead while our governments are in many places struggling. But we need to, at the same time, ask governments to set the right rules, to align incentives. Do you know that governments are spending $1.8 trillion a year in environmentally harmful subsidies? We're basically investing in our demise. What if we repurposed or repositioned this to be in service of nature, in service of people, and all these justice issues and equity issues that we need to deal with? So we cannot say that business alone can do this. We need governments to set the rules. We need business to show up with bold and brave and humble leadership and humane leadership. And we need civil society to hold both to account and to use their votes and wallets and voices to do so. So it's a trisectoral approach that is needed to advance this agenda, because we all have a role and responsibility in making it happen. And we go to COP and we try to set bold and brave goals on climate and nature, and we've now become a little more holistic about including the humane dimension. And then we go home and our governments, who are the only stakeholders really at the negotiation table there, they actually go back to investing in our demise. $550 billion a year subsidizing fossil fuel. We know we have to get out. It is insane. So I just don't want us to think, as much as business can do, that we can do it without writing the rules of the game, without respecting the bridges we need to build to civil society and citizens in making this happen.
I want to just dig a little deeper on this topic, because I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that I am in Copenhagen, and it's in many ways it's enlightening, because this is a society, and I'm Dutch, so we're actually quite similar, but I can say it now about the Danish without it in any way sounding sacramental. I'm in a hotel, and the hotel owner has lunch, and I can see the owner sitting there, and then there's a few managers. They wear suits because they're front office, and then at the same lunch table, there are a few workers of the hotel that have in Denmark, they wear these trousers with big pockets, and there's tools in them. These are manual laborers, experts undoubtedly, plumbers, electricians, I don't know, but they're at the lunch table with the owner, and they're just consulting. Now, I live in New York City, and that picture is unimaginable in America. And we go as the IRG, we have CMO roundtables all over the world, in countries where the business culture, the social structure is such that there is a gap there so big that they don't talk to each other. Now I want to reconnect it to the previous discussion, humbleness, listening to the people that are on the coalface, are talking to your clients. How do we, if it's culturally not normal, how do we get these leaders to get closer to the people that really have the answers?
Yeah, I think this is a profound question, and I risk sounding too proud of being Nordic, but let's look at what social cohesion is like and where we are on sustainability and equality across the Nordics versus where we are, for example, in the United States on social cohesion. We're at the breaking point. The social contract is broken. And I would say, capitalism and the capital economic system has become so interwoven with the political system that no one trusts anyone anymore, including media. We're in the perfect storm in America and many other countries. Brazil is another place where we have quite the challenges along these lines, and many others. UK is probably not very proud of what's been happening there on the political scene, or even around Brexit and all these things that are happening. So I think we cannot lead in an era like this in the way that we always have done. I actually think that leading from the elite alone, and I represent a lot of leaders who would belong to that group, the elite, is possible. So one of the things that we're navigating at the B team, and I would strongly suggest that people here who have the influence to do so, And it started back in 2019, where we brought 15 global CEOs and 15 climate kids together in a dialogue in an IKEA store. And you could have wanted to run out of that room when people arrived, because neither group trusted each other. There was that evidence of the low trust we have between generations, and across so many other divides, including global north and global south. And we had a lot of young children that are fighting for their future from the global south in the room. But after a while, connecting as human and finding sort of our shared humanity, there was so much more common ground, and trust started to build through gaming and conversations and dialogue. And we came out, and today IKEA has a sustainability advisory for all of its development to become people and planet positive from that group of youth activists. They actually have over 20 youth activists on a sustainability advisory for them. Very brave and very hard. I don't think anybody really knows how to do it. So that's kind of one example I'd like to lift. Another one is about Harley Davidson, which is in Wisconsin. And there are so many deep divides there along racial lines, economic lines. There's a food desert, the politics are hard, a lot of things are hard, but this is Harley's home. And Jochen is profoundly passionate about shared prosperity and a healthy planet. You know, that's been his passion. Environmentist, and he's a conservationist, and yet he's in a company that works within the fossil fuel industry. So how do you transition very important jobs and a community like that where people are yelling at each other? How do you build bridges? So one thing we did last year, we brought together his full stakeholder system for 3 days in appreciative inquiry, talking about how people ranging from high school students to his boardroom directors to people on the worker floor to other businesses, neighborhood activists, the public servants and the local community. How do we come together to navigate from this moment of difficulty to a future where we build on our shared strengths, but understand that the future is only possible as a positive force if we have shared prosperity? And it was so clear that people across all these divides agreed so much more than possible. So if you have a well-designed process and you really engage multiple stakeholders in addressing these challenges together, that to me is sort of a new form of leadership that I think we need to do a lot more of.
Well,
Because
I
people
love
don't
how
feel
you,
they have voice.
yeah, I love how you rephrase the humbleness as true courage, because it takes enormous courage to go into that room as leader and listen instead of talk about boldness. There was a question in the chat from Artsu, big supporter of the Institute for Real Growth, around what do you do when you see that indeed out of necessity, it's usually not ill will, but people are effectively greenwashing. They're beginning to say messaging on behalf of the company, which you're part of, things that just don't ring true all the way throughout. What's the step in calling that out, and how do you do that without just resigning?
That's a good question. So greenwashing is real, and there's a lot of it, and I come across it a lot. And I am, as you may have figured out in this conversation, I have a lot of heart for this. So it's very difficult for me to deal with it. But I have also learned that building on-ramps onto this route to the future is more important than burning bridges, because actually burning bridges is taking us backwards. So I try to have a conversation, whether it's with my own leaders or leaders that we often convene. We convene regularly something we're calling brave fasts, where we have a couple of B team leaders speaking to peers about nature, about scope 3 emissions, about how to get to gender balance and racial equity and different tough issues. And we do it on Zoom rooms now mostly. And you'd be surprised at how vulnerable leaders are right now, because I think most leaders understand the complex situation we're in, and they hear it even from their own kids. So I, again, try to drop into sort of get them to drop a little bit from their head where they see all the reasons for why they can't get there, because that data isn't available, or they just don't have the investor backing, or their boardroom isn't behind, like all the reasons we can figure out why we are not being bolder, and drop to their heart. I often ask leaders, what are you speaking to your children about? What was Thanksgiving like? What were you speaking about around the table? What are your children thinking about doing? Have your children been out protesting? Do you know 1 in 5 Americans participated in protests last year? And this is in America. We are in a social revolution already. And so I ask them, are you going to lead or be left behind? And so I try to encourage them to kind of think about this as something they deeply care about, because only when you have a deep care and passion for what you're doing can you be really bold. If you're just doing it to check the boxes, you are probably going to be greenwashing. So I really try to unlock their humanity. And I find that going through the next generation, the conversation about their children, and frankly, most of the CEOs I speak to who are really brave, they have a story about a question that their daughter asked them. And I'm sorry to say this, but it is very often their daughters. Because it feels like it might be passing boys. A lot of boys, certainly my son asks me very hard questions. But my daughter is the one that asks me the ones that just hit me in my heart. And one CEO told me a story in Davos, which is one of those places that is just so removed from the reality of people. But he is in the fossil fuel, the CEO, and he told me, this is years ago, that his daughter asked him, are you going to be responsible for the greatest intergenerational crime in history? And this changed this man. Like, he is still the CEO. He's fighting his board and investors, and he's trying to navigate this transition, and he's not going at the speed and scale I want him to. And there is stuff he's done that I think would be greenwashing, purpose washing, pink washing even. But I know he's trying to do it for the right reasons now, and he's moving faster than the others because it came from there. So my best advice to you is try to go to the heart, try to unlock the humanity in those you meet, ask them hard questions.
Well, you said two things. I thought going to the heart would be one of my paraphrasing of your answer, and the other would be use the on-ramps. In other words, if someone's greenwashing, but they're getting very positive reactions. I think someone once said, imagine how they would react if it was really true.
Yeah.
Now, we always end, and we do need to end in a minute, in the same way, which is first, a massive thank you for you taking the time, sharing your experience and your passion, because it's so clear, your passion. But also, I would like to ask your direction, your consult. Who else should this audience, a converted audience that's trying to do the right thing, but is in a very clear space within the corporate dynamic, who else should they hear from? Who else should we talk to?
I have many, as you know, Mark, because all of the B team leaders would be deserving of it, and you already have Paul. But at the risk, we talked about the need for more egalitarian values, or the Nordic values are needed in the world. I'm going to suggest you speak to our new chair at the B team. Paul was our chair for many years, and now Jesper Broden, the CEO of Inca Group, or the parent company of the IKEA stores globally, should be your guest. Why? It's another Nordic leader who actually lives in Netherlands, so you might have some common ground there. He's a Swede by birth, but IKEA has put out this vision to be people and planet positive by 2030. It's probably the boldest vision out there. It's one of the most successful brands that actually serves the many people in the world and really thinks about the many people, not the 1% or the exclusive crowd in the world. And so I think they're onto something. They have been convening, and we're working with them, and I worked with them on something called One Home, One Planet. He's also been scrutinized for not doing enough because he's at the forefront. So I think you could have some really interesting conversation with Jesper, who's just a really good leader, and unlike maybe what we often see.
We will follow your advice. And I want to end thanking everyone for listening in. I want to remind you that our next conversation is my partner, Frank van den Driest, talking to the CEO of Heineken globally in 2 weeks' time, Dolf van der Brink. And I want to end by once again thanking you, Halla, for being here as such a champion of just what's right. You've inspired me. I think you've inspired many of the people if I look at the chat. And I just really appreciate this wisdom at the beginning of the weekend to think it through. Thank you, and hopefully see you in person sometime soon.
I hope so, Mark, and thank you for having me. And just to all of you, be the change. I mean, this is not the time for the sidelines. So lean in and from your heart, unapologetically.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye, and please feel welcome 2 weeks from now, Frank van den Driest, the Humanised Growth Series of the Institute for Real Growth. And if you're interested in the Panama retreat, go to www.connectingtohumannature.com and have a great weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.